There you go. You just hit the right arrow, left arrow. Yeah, why don't you come over here? Yeah, you can come over here. That's all right. This way we can hear you a lot better. There you go. Tell us about.
So, my location was Kerma, and with this location, I thought it was going to be probably like a temple and just one place where I could focus on and just present on it, but it wasn't really that. It was like certain sites spread out, and so it was kind of difficult at first to find the important stuff. But then I was like, well, if I can't find one thing, so I'll just try and mention the important things that I found. So, Kerma is located on the east bank in the lower Dongla Reach. Kerma became the center of the first Nubian kingdom, and Kerma existed from 2500 to 1500 BC.
So you see, you're past the third cataract. You're right by the third cataract.
Yep.
So the first cataract's up there by Aswan, then the second one, and then the third one. Okay, go ahead. So basically, we're down in area that the Egyptians control some of the time, but not all the time.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's present-day Sudan. As I said, not just one location, but it has multiple artifacts. Kerma's beginning, it came into power by invading the upper side of Egypt, and it connected the lower and the upper part of Egypt, including Kush. So it was the largest Egyptian empire since the New Kingdom. So Alara was known as the first king of the Nubian Empire, but they were taken down by the Assyrian Esarhaddon.
Oh, Esarhaddon. Yeah.
Esarhaddon.
Esarhaddon.
These are the two pictures of the.
Oh, I see. Esarhaddon. Local enemies.
Yeah. Kerma was founded by the archaeologist George Resner. During the 20th century, classic Kerma is known as the Golden Age, and 16 pyramids, burial sites, and the mystery of the miniature pyramids. So that's like the three things that were basically mentioned that were around there. I guess. Would you say it's a city?
Yeah, city.
Yeah.
Or a site. There's multiple things at this site.
Yeah.
By the way, this guy's from Boston. This excavation was done by the Boston Museum of Fine Arts and Harvard, kind of a joint thing.
The Dafufa. So the Dafufa is either derived from the Nubian term for a mud brick building or from the Arabic word dafa, meaning mass or pile. There are three known Dafufas: the Western Dafufa, Eastern Dafufa, and the third less known Dafufa. I just it's pretty.
You like the word?
Yeah,
you know the word in Arabic for glove is kafuf.
Kafuf. Kafuf?
Cover. Kafufa. Kafuf.
Kafufa or kafuf?
Kafuf.
Okay. Yeah.
I think it must come from the same root. To cover, like mud bricks, covering things.
Yeah. Oh. Yeah, Dafufa is my moist to you. Well, you're moist.
No, you don't like moist, but you do like Kafufa.
All right.
But you like to say it because other people don't like it.
I guess so.
Something like that.
Some facts of the Western Dafufa. It's the most preserved out of the three. Like the other two, it's made up of mud bricks. It is measured to be 18 meters in height, and it covers 1,400 square meters. So,
that's pretty big.
Yeah, I thought, from the picture, I thought it was going to be something small. It looked pretty small. I was like, oh, that's nothing. But when I read the how big it was. I was like,
1,400 square
yeah,
meters.
never mind. That's
pretty big.
It's pretty big.
It's over 5,000. I guess 5,000 square feet. It'd be more than 5,000 square feet because you have to multiply each side by 3. Well, never mind. It's big. What's
Yeah,
that?
it's
18 meters tall. That's like huge. Actually.
Yeah,
18 meters tall. Yeah.
it's a tall.
So if you stood next to it, that's like a few cars on top
Mhm.
of each other.
Yeah. 3
Yeah.
feet, more than 3 feet for every meter.
Yeah, and it said about I talked about paintings and decoration that are well preserved on the sides, but I couldn't find any pictures of it. Yeah, it is assumed to be connected to religious life, but historians aren't 100% sure on that. The Eastern
Got a
Tufufa.
question right here.
Oh,
Oh, never mind.
oh, go
I
ahead.
was going to ask because it looked like buildings or whatever. I was confused if the fufu were like the buildings or the thing in the back of what the next picture showed it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because I mean the Arabic term means like pile, so I'm assuming it's just
Yeah.
like this pile of mud bricks. It is the Eastern Tufufa is smaller than the Western one, but the historians do know the purpose for this one because there's 30,000 graves surrounding its area, so it was a cemetery, and it was once thought to be served as a royal funerary chapel. The Shabaka, known as
He's in that movie, Star Wars. Chewbacca.
I've never actually watched Star Wars. I've only watched
Oh.
2. Yeah, but
All right.
I do know Chewbacca, not Shabaka.
Well, I heard that there was a Chewbacca like lady on campus here a few years ago, and got free tuition.
Yeah,
Did you hear about that?
I did hear about that. Yeah.
You did. Okay. Well, I don't know if it's true. I just saw like a little video clip.
Yeah.
It is true. Okay.
Known as beautiful is the soul of Re. It is in the picture. It is thought to be the son of King Kastra and Petchatat.
Yeah, these are tough ones.
Yeah, Peptajama.
Pettajama.
Pettajama.
Something like that.
But text from Tahak states that it is Pi and his son. So there might be some dispute on who the people are. Shabaka was the second Nubian ruler and died in 707 or 706
You see how
BC.
much this stuff looks Egyptian.
Yeah.
Even though technically what we're talking now, the Egyptians, they come down and control this. But what we're focusing on is then later on when Egypt is weaker and the Nubians actually get stronger and they come in and take over upper Egypt.
The Shabaka Gate. So this was thought to be it's a large stone door unearthed by archaeologists in 2011, and it was thought to have protected the king's treasure. So I'm assuming it was like this big wall that was surrounding this one area, and then just over time it just basically collapsed. The Shabaka stone is a relic from the Nubian 25th dynasty of Egypt, incised with an important Egyptian religious text, the Mephite theology. It is a stone slab measuring 66 centimeters in height and 137 meters in width. That purpose, couldn't really read much up on it, didn't say much in the article, but those were the artifacts I found.
All right.
All right.
Any questions, comments? Now, the area that the site that you ended up choosing is an area where there's not a lot of work that's been done for a variety of reasons. But Nubia is an important area. And, of course, we talked about it earlier when we mentioned Hatshepsut had moved down into Nubia and, sort of did a expedition, it's called, down there, and took the goods from there. Very good. Yeah. You got it? All right. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I did Morea. I was a bit disappointed.
Oh,
I kind of just went eeny, meeny, miny, mo, picked a random one, and
Yeah.
turns out, well, maybe I shouldn't have done that. But you know what? I learned something.
You learned something. Not to go eeny, meeny, miny, mo.
Yes. Yes. I was up to the challenge. I might not do it again.
I'm sure that you are. Okay, go ahead.
So this is a little map here. You have Egypt here going down the Nile. This is more specifically the river delta, more so the western part. You can see Alexandria here. But what we're concerned about is a little area here called Lake Mareotis or Lake Mareotuk or something. It has a lot of weird names. But Morea is on the bank of this area.
Okay. Seems good so far.
It does.
Okay.
But it gets...
It's worse.
Well, I found out, and I was pretty upset at the end.
Oh, you're going to save that for the end. All right.
Yes. So, some background of Morea. This right here is Lake Mareotis. It is considerably smaller now. Like, this part right here is pretty much what is left of it now. The whole part that's white was what it used to be before the 19th century. But yeah, it's situated on the west side of the Nile. It's kind of the border between Egypt and Libya. It's about 40 kilometers southwest of Alexandria. Herodotus said that it was established as a military defense. There were garrisons there, he believed, during the time of Psamtik I. And that would have been in the 26th dynasty, during the late period. I believe may have been Thucydides who believed that it was actually established by Libya and was established so that Egypt would go fight the Persians instead of them. So some disputes over it. But that's the earliest accounts of when Morea is believed to have existed. But later on I found out, So, I'll get to...
He likes to tease
I'm
us with
foreshadowing.
that. Okay.
So some history of the excavations.
So now the camera's coming in on the doorknob.
Yes. So the first excavations of this site was started in 1977. From 77 to 81, it was led by a guy from Alexandria University. I don't know what his first name is. Probably Farouk. So F.L. Fakharani.
Maybe Fauzi.
It could be.
Could be. I don't know.
I couldn't find the guy.
Okay.
He mainly looked at the southern port area of
Maybe
Morea.
he checked into the Turkish embassy. That's what he
Good point. He could have. He may not be alive though.
Okay.
During the 90s, early 2000s, I'm guessing. He didn't give an exact date, but there were some students from the University of Warsaw in Poland who did some work in the same area. And then around July 2003, some more work started, but on a different part of the site by a group, excuse my French, literally, because I don't know if I'm pronouncing this right, Centre d'études Alexandrine,
That's pretty good. That's
or
pretty good. That's not bad.
or CE Alex.
Very good. Yeah.
I'm just,
I like it.
I'm not.
The Center for Alexandrian Studies.
Yes.
Yeah, close enough.
So, or Cialis.
Wait a minute. Hold on.
I mean, I think
What?
that works better.
I do not want to comment.
Okay.
I do not want to comment. I'm saying
You do not wait, never mind. I'm trying to make it.
yeah, you better keep going. Don't stop on that.
Alright.
Keep
So
moving.
this right here is a picture of the site. This little part right here, the far left edge would correspond with this peninsula right here, and this right here is this causeway. It was believed to be maybe a lighthouse here, but this is the main part that was excavated early on. This was preserved pretty well compared to most other sites. It's relatively remote and hard to get to, and so even though it was remote, though, most people didn't bother doing much excavation
I
on
mean,
it.
look at it.
Yeah, it doesn't look like there's much. Probably there's more stuff behind this, and this is just the line. I'm imagining this would have been kind of the pier area or the port. So some archaeological finds. Most of what they had were structures. They had some jetties here. This map is all in French.
That's good for you.
It was led by French people.
French.
So yeah, you have these jetties here. This right here would have been that pier. There were some shops, like in this area here, like commerce. They even had a mill to the northeast. They don't know if it was oil or flour, but either way, some kind of mill involving agriculture. They also had bathhouses. They had 2 symmetrical bathhouses, believed to be one for men and one for women. And they had a cold, a warm, and a hot in both of those.
That sounds familiar.
So I would go separate but equal, but I think that's a little bit
Might
later.
be against the law.
I think that might be against the law. So my analysis. This is where I was sad, because the first part is good, right?
Okay.
The existence of an oil or flour
Good news,
mill.
bad news. Give us the good
Yes, it's not quite a sandwich. It's kind of like a nice croissant with like chartwells on top.
news.
That's about it. I can say that I work there, even though they say we're not
This is
supposed
all
to
being
talk about it.
recorded,
I don't care
Okay,
at
that's
this
all
point.
right.
So yes, some agricultural activity. This may have been a prominent economic site. They also had bathhouses. They had shopping centers. There could be quite a bit of wealth there. This was also en route to a pilgrimage to a monastery further southwest called Abu Mina. So this could have been a resting spot for pilgrims on their way heading there. And so they would house them there in hostels, and they would feed them, whatnot. So a lot of activity going on. But then I found out that most of this dated to the 5th to 7th centuries AD. Now, I didn't see, considering I saw, around like 600 BC something, that it was originally founded by an Egyptian pharaoh, I didn't think anything of that until I realized it said AD. And I realized, well, that's not good, because that means it's not Egyptian, most likely. But it does correlate to a site called Philoxenite during the reign of Anastasius. So that would have been during the Byzantine Empire.
Yes.
So most of what they found was not actually Egyptian, it was Byzantine. However, there were some older stuff. I don't know exactly what. I'd imagine probably the mill would be. I don't imagine the bathhouses would have been. But because there are
This
older...
isn't too far from the coast, right?
No. Essentially, it's right on the southern border of Lake Mariotic,
Yes.
which there's a strip of land north of that, which blocks it from the Mediterranean.
Right.
So
Right.
it's isolated between the Mediterranean and the Nile and doesn't touch either of them. It's quite fascinating, the geography of that.
Yeah.
But even though I found it interesting, the different things about the marble cased bathhouses and the fact that there would have been a lot of economic activity, it most likely wasn't Egyptian. However, there were some aspects of it that were built a lot earlier. However, we don't really know specifically what the site of Morea, the original site built during the 26th dynasty, what that would have entailed. We know more so the Byzantine.
Okay. So is that it?
That was my big letdown, was the fact that I did all this and found out it wasn't even Egyptian.
Well, I wouldn't say it's not Egyptian. It's later Egyptian.
Well,
It was founded, though, by an Egyptian
it was during
pharaoh,
the late period.
period.
But what they found was more so a different culture entirely.
She has a question.
For you, either of you, what do you consider ancient Egypt?
Aha. See, now that's the good question.
Well, I went based off of, considering this is in the 7th century AD, like 5th to 7th century AD,
Right.
like that's a considerably...
But go back to your first slide. Boom, boom, boom. 1977. No, right here. 664 BC.
Yes, and So that's why when I saw 5th to 7th century, I thought, okay, that corresponds to that, until I realized it was saying
Oh,
AD.
yeah.
And so the buildings themselves were built much
Well,
later.
they would have done it the other way. They would have done 7th to 5th century if it's BC.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, but this is fine. This is good.
Yeah.
It's good. Any more questions? Oh, we never answered her question. You going to answer her question? You want me to answer
Yeah, I
her
would-
question? You tell her your answer, and I'll tell you mine.
I mean, I can't really say I'm the expert here, but
Well, that's-
probably after the late period, I'd imagine would
Right.
be when. Well, I'd imagine once the issue with the Greeks didn't go in favor of the Egyptians, I'd imagine that would kind of be the end of that. At the end of the Ptolemies.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, if you're talking, you wanted to know, your question was, what is the period of ancient Egypt?
Yeah.
Okay.
Or like, did ancient Egypt coexist with ancient Greece?
Right.
Because I feel like it's so subjective.
Well, I don't know if it's completely subjective. In the later period, when you get past the New Kingdom and you have the second intermediate period, then you have the late period. The late period is a lot of upheaval in Egypt. There are people invading them. The Assyrians, because we just talked about, he talked about an Assyrian going all the way down into Nubia, right? The Assyrians come and take over, and then their power diminishes. The Persians come and take over, their power diminishes. And then the Greeks come, Alexander the Great. So this would have been during the period, but there were relationships, we say, between classical Greece and Egypt. In fact, classical Greeks thought Egypt was the sort of epitome of ancient culture because it was so much older than them. And they imitated some of the artwork. They had trade with them, so forth. I talk more about that when I talk about ancient Greece. But then Alexander the Great period comes, and you have a new dynasty that begins, which is really a kind of merging of Egyptian and Greek culture. Like
Which creates.
the Ptolemaic period of Egyptian history. So from around, let's say roughly 300 BC down to the time of the Romans. The Romans don't really take it over till the time of Julius Caesar. So that's all the way down, like, say, through Cleopatra. There are several Cleopatras, by the way, but the most famous of one is the last one. It is a hybrid, like syncretism, some people use, or what kind of term. You take a lot of Egyptian elements and Greek elements, and they put them together. But I still think that's an important part of it. A lot of the sources that we have about ancient Egyptian history come from that period. And by the way, it was near here, not too far from here. They've done a lot of work of the period of the Hellenistic period. Alexandria, did you have that on a map somewhere?
Yeah.
Yeah. There's Alexandria. You see where Alexandria is? Right? Alexandria, and then you're right over here, right? So you're very close. Alexandria was the capital of Egypt in the Ptolemaic period, named for Alexander the Great. And it had a huge harbor there with a great lighthouse, a library. They have the 7 wonders of the ancient world. 2 of the 7 wonders of the ancient world were in Alexandria, the lighthouse and the library. The library lasts until up until the Roman period, even until the Byzantine period. And the lighthouse, the ruins of which are there. And by the way, they've done a lot of work here in this area here, finding the old harbor. There was an exhibit I went to 4 or 5 years ago about Cleopatra and the excavations that were done sort of underwater, stuff out in the harbor. And it was all in this area. All right, very good. We better... You got enough?
Oh, one more point. I did see something about, there was another site, I think it was called Teposiris.
Okay.
Magma or something like that, something
Right.
along those lines, where lawyer from the Dominican Republic.
Oh no.
She believed she found something that relates to the tomb of the last Cleopatra.
Okay.
This was earlier in this year, so maybe something.
So this is brand new. We need to look into it. All right. Thank you. Thank you. All right. Go ahead, Abby.
All right. So, my site was Jibline, which has some different pronunciations. Jeblin, Jibline, just depends on how people think it should be interpreted. So, where is it at? Let's see. That little star right there. It is pretty far down, not too far away from Luxor or what would have been Thebes. So it's about 28 kilometers southwest of that. Its modern Arabic name means the two rocks, and it has the same meaning as the ancient name, just kind of translated into Arabic. It would have been Inerti, which, if you can see here, this would have been the representation of the two rocks, which is what the meaning of the name was.
So Jebel can mean hill or mountain.
Mm-hmm.
So Jebeline is the plural, the dual.
Mm-hmm.
Two mountains. Two hills.
This is the hills that they're talking about and kind of what they look like today. The West Mount over here, East Mount over there. You can't really see it very well, but it's a little farther away. They kind of are the biggest geological feature of the area, and it's kind of not exactly two direct mountains, but they're almost just little hills and valleys going back and forth that run kind of north to south. Which is interesting, they named them east and west.
Nile in the background?
That is the Nile, yes.
Yep.
So the history of excavation, it was visited by a lot of travelers and scholars in the 18th century. Those included Ludwig Norden, Richard Pocock, and Dominique Vivien Denon. So those were just kind of people who were in and out, just looking around. But the first official research was initiated by Gaston Maspero in 1885.
That's the guy we're looking at.
Yep, that is the picture you're looking at, because he did some of the most detailed work in that area of the early research.
He was a very big wheel in Egyptian antiquities in the late 19th century.
So I believe he was actually also the gentleman who excavated my previous site as well.
Mm-hmm.
But it's unknown where in the area he was working, because if you saw that kind of picture here, it's not really a very small area of archaeological site. It kind of comes from here all the way to that far side over there. So there isn't really any information on where he was working. So there's a lot of people excavated this site, which is interesting because there's not a lot of detailed information on what they were all doing and what they found. But there were a couple of gentlemen who went and copied some inscriptions, and there were a couple more excavations followed by that in the late 1800s. Also in 1893, Jacques de Morgan sent the inspector of Upper Egyptian antiquities to do a couple of excavations there. And in 1896, there was a first intermediate period tomb with 5 sarcophagi discovered, and those objects were sent to the Royal Museum in Berlin. And from the information I found, that is some of the things that were found there. So another kind of issue with this area was there was a big history of looting in the area. So around the 1900s, it was well known to antiquities dealers as a place where they could go and get things without having to kind of fight to be able to keep them. So because of the antiquity service practices at the time, they were pretty much allowing anyone to kind of have a license who was local in the area and wanted to do an excavation. And because it was kind of thought of as a provincial site and not a main archaeological site, they let whoever was excavating there keep about half of whatever they found. And the problem was most people kept more than half and did not turn over the stuff they found to the antiquity service. So Ernest Alfred Wallace Budge found that Gebleen was an ideal place to find early mummified Egyptians who were pretty much naturally mummified. They weren't mummified with any extra sources other than the dry sand of Egypt. And he was looking for bodies that he would date to the Nadak culture, and he found about 6 of those in Gebleen.
Sorry, about that mummy, do you know if they removed any organs or just and then just tossed them to the ground or just tossed them straight?
There is a little bit more information on him on the next couple slides.
Okay.
So, yeah, I'll get there. But he, there was also Robert de Rustafagel also found a natural mummy there, but there's it's in his collection of items, but there's not very much information about where the mummy was found or anything else other than where it was from.
By the way, Budge is another famous guy, and also if you look at a lot of the Book of the Dead information, Budge put a lot of that together.
So about that specific mummy that we were looking about, that is Ginger, which was known as the Gebleen Man. And until the late pre-dynastic period, for burials, they pretty much just buried very shallow graves in the sand and let the sand do the job of dehydrating the body. So they didn't really remove very many organs, and they didn't do a whole lot of that. They just mostly buried and let nature take its course. The kind of problem with this was, which is why Egyptians later moved to tombs, was the winds could uncover these shallow graves, or animals could come and scavenge on the bodies because they weren't perfectly dehydrated and they weren't buried very securely. So it's actually really incredible to find such well-preserved natural mummies like that. So this particular one was found in 1896 in a shallow grave in the Egyptian sand, and he was believed to live around 3500 BC in an area very close to the Nile that was identified as Gebleen. So, some interesting things about him. Once he was actually put on exhibit and stuff, he was moved around a couple times to some medical centers to have some CAT scans and CT scans, 3D imaging done of his body. And they actually found out that he was murdered by being stabbed in the back. They found an incision on the skin.
That happens to me every day.
Why do you look at me?
It's quite rare, actually, that you can find the cause of death on someone this old, but because he was so well preserved, you could see the cut in the skin, the damage to the ribs and internal organs, and the severity of the injury and the fact that there was no healing evidence led them to believe that that was his cause of death, and he was stabbed
In the back.
in the back. Yeah. Oh, and then that's a picture of him at the medical center getting scanned. So there was more excavation done around 1900, but this was more of a purchase than an excavation. James Quibell bought a set of artifacts that the person he purchased it from identified as being from Gebleen, and so there's actually a large collection of this that was purchased and brought to the Cairo Museum at the time. But it's very almost circumstantial to say that it's from Gebleen because there was no archaeological evidence that it was found there. It was just purchased, and that was where it was identified as. So in 1907, Henry de Morgan also visited, and a lot of his artifacts ended up in the Metropolitan Museum of New York. And in 1908, 1909, some scholars from Lyon excavated, and most of their findings were put in Lyon. So a lot of the first round of excavations of Gebleen ended up in Cairo, Berlin, and Lyon. So kind of the big second round of excavation of Gebleen would have been done by the Egyptian Museum of Turin, which was at the time directed by Ernesto Skip Parnelli. He began doing excavations in 1910 and continued in 1911, 1914, and 1920. His successor also worked there in 1930, 1935, and 1937. And they renewed some of their excavations in 1990 in order to help draw an archaeological map of the site because it was being threatened by local farmers who wanted to make a sugarcane field. So some of the things that was found by the excavations done by the museum were the tomb of Idi and his wife Neferu. So they were from the first intermediate period, and we have a stela pretty well preserved. We have parts of the tomb pretty well preserved, and then we have a really good example of some first intermediate period art that would have been found inside tombs because it was pretty well preserved as well. So another important piece that was found during that time would have been the linen, and so it was dated to that same kind of period that we saw those early mummies from, due to its artistic style, which, as you can see, is a little bit different than some of the other things that were found. It was discovered in 1930 by the Italian mission working there, and it was found next to a human body in a tomb. So this also kind of helped raise the question of whether Gabline was involved in some kind of, had royal people living there, some sort of local rulers or kings, because it was very similar to something that was found in Hercanopolis in what they believed was a royal local tomb. So then on the top you have some of the actual pieces found, and on the bottom you have a very rough and pixelated rendition of what an artist thinks it may have looked like based on the pieces that were found. So Gabline definitely played an important role in the history of ancient Egypt. The problem is we're not super sure what that was, because a lot of the objects acquired by James Quibdell at an antiquity market were not dated, and they weren't found in the actual area by someone who was recording what they were doing. They were just collected and then sold. And so a lot of the artifacts, along with other finds, suggest that there may have been some pre-dynastic rulers that were buried in the area, but it's very hard to tell because they weren't in a place where they could say, okay, this was here and that was there. And so based on where these things were in relation to each other, that's what we think happened. So one of those items would have been the dagger with a golden handle, and it was part of the artifacts that were dated to that Nadaka II or early Nadaka the third, and those were the ones purchased by James. So there were other important artifacts that kind of let us know that it would have been an important site during the Old Kingdom. The most famous find would have been a 4th century set of papyri, or about 11 papyri that were found. One of them is listed there on the right. They were discovered in a tomb located in the northern part in 1935. They had about 300 names of people who would have been part of almost an estate of the local area, and they included titles such as baker, brewer, craftsman, boatmaker, sailor, rower, mason, metalworker. You can read all the ones there. So it kind of let us know that there was definitely a lot going on in Gabline, and there would have been a lot of different kind of people working there. It would have been a functioning city area, which makes sense because it was located along the Nile pretty closely, so would have been people there. So I didn't want to talk on forever, but there was a lot more to talk about from Gabline. There was stuff found, more stuff found in the first intermediate period, more in the Old Kingdom, a little bit in the second intermediate period. The newer we get, the less we see, just because this wasn't excavated timely and it wasn't excavated with a lot of detail. Even though there were so many people that I talked about who excavated it, there was not a lot of notes and detail written down that went with that, so it's very difficult to say what Gabline's history was in relation to ancient Egypt. Oh, but I did want to say, if you can see this, see it got a little cut off, but these little daggers down here in the corner, they have like a crocodile handle, which related them to, can't remember the name right now, but would have been one of the ancient crocodile gods, and there's a thought that the city at one point would have been named or dedicated to that. So in conclusion, Gabline was a significant city during times in ancient Egypt history. It has been frequently mentioned in a lot of literature. And although a lot of important objects have been found there, we don't understand it very well because of the lack of detail and consistency. And because a lot of the objects lacked context. So there's a current research project in the Gablion area known as the Gablion Archaeological Project, which is hoping to help us understand more of what its importance was.
All right. Thank you. So let me say we'll finish these up since we don't have class Wednesday. We'll do them next Monday. The other thing I'll say is, when you look at the list, and you don't have to stick to that list I have. You could choose other things out of your atlas, that sort of thing, if you want. Well, I hope you have a good fall break.
And we'll start the source presentation